This is where students in an online program can have a little bit of the experience of sitting in a professor's office and talking and learning from people who've been in the field for a while. Today I have a wonderful guest. Her name is Sebern Fisher. Can you say hello?
Hi, Jordan. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
So glad to be here.
Awesome. And you specialize in neurofeedback. Is that right?
I do. Yes, I do.
Okay. Now, we have talked a little bit about neurofeedback in this podcast, but I was hoping you could give me a brief overview, because there are many different methods in this specialization, right?
Mhm.
About how you do neurofeedback, what is your approach, and then the clientele that you work with.
Sure. My client population are people who have suffered developmental trauma. As we now understand it, this devastating disorganization of the brain and mind and body that occur when children are neglected and abused and assaulted. I typically see these kids as grown-ups, although for many years I was the clinical director of a residential treatment program for severely disturbed adolescents. And it was during that time when I was facing a lot of treatment failures, even though we had one of the best programs in the state of Massachusetts, that I accepted an invitation from a friend of mine to go to try this odd thing called neurofeedback. This is actually almost exactly 22 years ago. And I had no idea what she was talking about when she said to me that these kids might be able to regulate themselves by playing video games with their brains. This felt to me like a preposterous notion, but she was getting a system. She's a friend of mine, and she asked me if I'd try it. So I said, well, sure. This is probably nothing. So I was skeptical. I was open but skeptical, and I went and did neurofeedback with her, which is really putting typically one or two electrodes on the head and asking you to, rewarding the brain when it plays a game that correlates to a certain frequency that you want the brain to make. So one of those frequencies might be alpha, 8 to 11 hertz, and that tends to be quite calming. So, but I was training, because this is what was available at that time, something called SMR, or 12 to 15 hertz. So every time my brain happened to cross 12 to 15 hertz, I would get a reward in the game. And by the end of that weekend, I was a changed person. I too had suffered developmental trauma, and I had never lived without the sense of ambient fear, and it's that I talk a great deal about in the book, because I doubt that I would have gotten into the field of neurofeedback, even as desperate as I was to help these kids and how untreatable they were typically. If I had just gone to a workshop or, sadly, listened to a webinar, right, a good interview or blog, I only would get into it when I had such profound effects for myself. And I write about that in the introduction to the book, and it's a story, so I won't go into all that in our time. So I work with a traumatized population. I got into this field in that way, and I follow a model called the arousal regulation model, which is very similar to what we do as psychotherapists, which is to how can we help this person regulate themselves and quiet their affect, what usually most salient is fear, terror. Shame is a huge problem in our population. Shamelessness is a problem in the antisocial we were talking about earlier, and rage is obviously a huge problem. And all of these feelings and emotions ride waveforms in the brain. different waveforms in different people. And what you're trying to do is to find out how you can be in a dialogue with training with this brain and find where it can find some peace with itself. And you'll see changes in the body, you'll see changes in posture, you'll see changes in affect, often changes in things like vocabulary or sleep. I mean, you know, as I'm fond of saying, that the brain knows nothing of the DSM. It doesn't even know anything about big differences between the body and the brain, right? It's a processing. I don't want to make this too much like computers because it's so much not that, but it is the learning organ of the brain. So how do we teach it, or how can we engage it in learning? I think is a better way to talk about it, and that's biofeedback to the frequency domain of brain function.
Yeah,
that was a long answer to a reasonably short question. I hope that covers the basis.
no, I think that's a really good introduction, especially because in my own training, I had never heard of neurofeedback. And I remember very specifically, I have a buddy who's a medical psychologist, and he was talking about how when he was going through his initial training, he went through a biofeedback course and learned to control migraines. And I had just had another coworker talking about how she relentlessly had these migraines. And I was like, if this is something that we know works, why is it not even talked about?
Right.
And then I heard Bessel talk about neurofeedback, Bessel van der Kolk, and how it was developed like in like the 50s and 60s. And you can see he was talking about a study in Australia with military people being deployed. And before each deployment, they would get tested, and you could see basically over time the prefrontal cortex going, I think, into delta, so slower waves, right? And the limbic areas going into higher, more erratic. And he's like, they're basically asleep, right? The thinking part of their brain is asleep. And I thought to myself, wait, like we already know this, but no one's talking. Like, how is this possible?
Right.
It seemed absurd, you know? It seemed absurd.
Well, it's tragic in a way.
Yeah.
And, you know, the first clinical use of neurofeedback was with seizures.
Right.
And still people will have brain surgery and never know that you could possibly control this by using biofeedback, but you can. And the test that was done was originally cats, and as far as we know, cats can't have a placebo effect, and they were able to shorten their or change their threshold, actually make the threshold higher to seizures with feedback, with brainwave feedback. And then eventually they used it for people coming, and they were on the neurosurgery calendar at UCLA, and they volunteered to come and try this weird thing where they would train their brains. And every single not one of them had psychosurgery after the training. And most of them learned to control the seizures by themselves, but even those who needed medication needed very little of it, and medication hadn't helped them before. Obviously, they wouldn't have been ready to have psychosurgery. So this is this is terrible that this isn't well known. And this should be taught in every medical school. It shouldn't be up to you to have people, to have our little private conversations that hopefully will go viral, but probably won't, where we get to discuss this incredible breakthrough in mental health, but in a lot of physical conditions as well.
Yeah, I think that it is mind-blowing. And I think also on a personal level, there's a little girl who goes to my church, and they have her on seizure medication because she's adopted, and so she has a few things that aren't quite normal, I guess you would say, I don't know a better word, and she has seizures. And in between that sort of medication, and the doctors basically said, this medication blunts IQ. And knowing that, and then knowing the side effects of many psychotropic drugs, which if you're on a psychotropic drug and it really does help, like, I want you to keep doing what works. But I've known plenty of people who have had negative effects from these drugs, and then you find something like this, which has a relatively, small downside, a huge potential upside, and you just have to think like, why is this not being talked about more?
Right. I mean, what we're doing here is appealing to the brain's ability to learn regulation, and we're counting on all brains having an inherent desire, as it were, to regulate themselves. They're devoted to their own a brain is devoted to its regulation because it has to be. That's what brains do. And we're off on these errant paths, and that we could call it, PTSD or flashback or seizure or tantrums, or, I mean, all everything. Everything is has a component in this frequency domain of the brain, and so we can, and then this doesn't help everybody, but the vast majority of people it helps really significantly. And there are YouTube videos you might want to attach to this. There's a video, I think it's called The Wild Child, but it's it's a child in Australia who is about to go to residential treatment in a juvenile detention center, actually, because he's attacked his mother so often and the police have come so often. So, we know these kids, and they are out of control, and they are dangerous to others and dangerous to themselves. And this kid is, you see him before neurofeedback, and you see him after 80 sessions of neurofeedback, and you wouldn't know you were really looking at the same kid. And he's happy, and so are we. And so is the world. Right?
Yeah, I think I haven't studied nearly as much as you have, but I studied a little bit about the science of emotions. And one of the things that we know is, no emotion is necessarily inherently bad, but we call them bad because they feel bad, right? People don't like to be stuck in anger. People don't like to be stuck in fear. People like to experience joy, and for me, that was that was something that was so amazing, because at least where I work and some of my jobs, people say, they just want to do X, Y, and Z. And I think that the science and talking to people says no. People that we're dealing with are deeply afraid, and I would say predominantly shamed, and they feel shameful about themselves. And the only way they know how to deal with this, and I mean know as in experientially, not like cognitively.
You're on it. You're onto it. Yeah,
is to do these behaviors that we as society say are bad, which only reinforces the cycle,
Right. Right. You may have seen the Oprah interview where she said the question needs to change from why did you do that?
20 years late. Like Vincent Felipe was talking about that, in the 80s, right? Like.
Right. I know. I know. It's amazing that she took so long to find it. But anyway, it's still not the question that most people ask, and she will help. She will help that. Yeah, I think you've hit on something that I think is really important, which is the whole notion of stuckness, because I think that's the problem. The brains get into certain loops. They get stuck in certain patterns of activity, and neurofeedback is a way to help them get unstuck. And it suggests that neuroplasticity, which we talk a lot about, is in the frequency domain of the brain. We know it's not in the chemical domain of the brain, because we provide chemicals and they don't create brain change. They create sedation, or they help people attend, but they're always toxic. The liver is always in a battle to get rid of these things. there isn't a psychotropic drug that isn't toxic. There are psychotropic drugs that do help, and that in the interim may be very useful. But they should be an interim solution until the brain learns its own way to regulate. And that can take a long time, or it can happen very quickly. And we don't know all the reasons for the differences.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I found enlightening as I started reading your book, I'm only halfway through, is you make a complete switch. We're taught so much the neurochemical reasons for any number of DSM sort of labels, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which personally I'm skeptic about, because I've read history, and about every 50 years everything changes anyway.
Right.
But the idea that what is wrong is a misfiring, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
or in some way the rhythms of the currents that are going between synapses is off. That is the issue more than a neurochemical imbalance.
Right. These are yes, I agree with you. These are co-arising domains. We can't get the firing without the chemicals or the neurotransmitters, and we can't get we can't get appropriate levels of neurotransmitters without appropriate firing. So where is the advantageous place to intervene? And the profitable place to intervene is chemical. I mean, I think it's $8 billion on atypical antipsychotics in children under 18. Really? And so but the plasticity, as I was saying a moment ago, really resides in the electrical domain. And so the better place, the more brain-friendly and person-friendly place to offer the brain its opportunity to regulation is in brainwave training. And I would say that it has a couple of other advantages. One is you have to assess every session, because you have to assess how the person is responding. And that teenage boys are going to engage in this treatment, which they hardly engage in any treatment typically. So, and they'll feel themselves, and it won't. The conversation will be often, what do you want to get better at? So let's just take, a typical adolescent. They might say, I want to get better at basketball. So I said, okay, then let's keep measuring your free throws. Tell me how we're going to measure the organization of this nervous system via free throws. You take out the stigma, you take out the the whole mental illness piece. When you think about the DSM, it's dismissible based on it really is a tautology. The DSM has among many disorders, it has oppositional defiant disorder. So what is that? That is a kid who's oppositional and defiant. So now we know. What do we know now? But now that they've been called, they've gotten a disorder name after it. You've got an insurance code, and that's really it. When you look more deeply into this person, you'll find that their brain isn't functioning optimally, and we can help them in the vast majority of cases.
Yeah, I'm actually I also blog a little bit about this for my students, and I'm writing about this now. And the example that I'm using is arthritis. I've been told that I have arthritis in my knee, and I looked up what arthritis means, and it means pain, which is crazy because I went to my doctor and I said, hey, I'm having this pain in my knee, and he says, well, it's arthritis. So what you're saying is the pain in my knee is caused by the pain in my knee.
Right.
You haven't told me anything.
Right.
And
Right.
I think you talk about depression,
Mm-hmm.
people have, overwhelming sadness and hope and helplessness? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm,
Now,
mm-hmm.
is that caused by depression? Well, that's the definition of depression. So
Right,
can't
right,
get into that circular sort of
right,
logic.
right.
But I do want to expand a little bit and back up, because I think the thing that is most fascinating as I began to read your book was you worked for a long time with very, very difficult children.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Could you talk a little bit about that work? Because I think that that sort of clientele would really resonate with a lot of the people who listen to this.
Yeah, sure. I worked with both residential and foster care kids. So kids who were um, in Western Massachusetts. There was a consent decree, which meant that kids had to be in facilities with in the least amount of constraint. Right. So our facility was open, and we had the kids otherwise would have been under lock and key. I mean, they were aggressive, they were dissociative. We had it was not always understood, but it was not all that uncommon for us to have kids with DID. We had so antisocial kids and sex offenders. Now, I worked with all of these kids to the extent that we could, and they would age out at 18. The state wouldn't pay for them anymore. And what happened then was that in the vast majority of cases, they would end up on clinical roll somewhere else, or they would have stolen a car, and one kid stole a car that had a baby in it, and they hadn't noticed there was a baby in it. So that's what we, with all of our best efforts, that's still what would go on. And and you know what, we would often be able to see these kids twice a week. These are not circumstances that are available anymore. So they end up being in the adult mental health system, and many die in it.
Yeah, I work on a suicide, not a suicide, an inpatient hospital, and a lot of the people that we see are there for suicide and for other issues.
Mm-hmm.
As you're talking about this, I keep thinking these are the people that I'm seeing. Um, these are the clients that I regularly see, and um, I seriously think about how can I help these people, because my heart breaks, because I know that a lot of them have been in the system in some way before, and obviously it wasn't helpful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know.
Well, no, I mean, psychotherapy is, when you're so overwhelmed by terror, there's no indication that you can really receive or participate in psychotherapy. It's really, I'll do anything not to feel so bad, including killing myself. I'll do head banging, I'll cut myself, I'll burn myself, anything but to feel so terrible as I feel. And I have enormous empathy for this. I don't think there's any disease that's worse than what we think of as mental illness. I think people suffer about as terribly as with any disease. And most of them going to live with this for a good deal of time. I mean, there are people have acute episodes of depression or anxiety, or it's situational. They're the kind of people that you and I are talking about, people who have had this severe neglect and abuse in childhood. Their nervous systems are set off on a track that has only to do with survival. Ruth Lanius is a researcher on trauma in Canada. And she said that just recently, in investigating trauma deeply with neurofeedback and with fMRI, she said there's not one part of the human brain that is not affected by developmental trauma, from the sense of balance to the sense of self, from the cortex to the brainstem. So it's all, and none of it looks the same as those who are not abused. So that's really important. And And she's also said recently, she was interviewed by someone who said, come on, tell me what the therapy is that you would use for trauma. And she said, the therapy, the psychotherapy that I use is going to be dependent on the patient. But I wouldn't do any psychotherapy now without neurofeedback. And that's the way I feel, with people who have had no opportunity interpersonally to regulate their brains, to develop a prefrontal cortex, for that matter, to develop even earlier systems in the brain, like the cerebellum. Many people have no experience of being held in the back of their heads, rocked or cherished in any way, and they don't have any memory of that. And that's, it is my sense that it's my firm belief that the gift of a good enough mother is affect regulation. That's what our mothers do for us. And when that happens, that's the gift going forward. So you have good enough affect regulation, you had good enough mothering. When that hasn't happened, that's when neurofeedback comes into play to help the nervous system learn that, or learn to regulate itself and to lower its affective load.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that was fascinating reading through the book is you basically say the problem, or somebody can do well in therapy if they can use the relationship. Mm-hmm. And the people that we're dealing with, the people who are chronically in the mental health system, part of the problem is not that the therapist doesn't have the right tools. The person doesn't have the ability to receive the therapy. They don't have that relationship, that model of a healthy attachment figure, which is the sort of box to put in all the things that the therapist is attempting to do.
Not only do they not have the model, which they don't have the brain structures. So when you look at a part of the brain called the default mode network, which is getting a lot of attention now, it is a structure right down the center of the brain that helps to regulate the amygdala. It helps to quiet fear circuits. But it is also the self system. And when you can look at, there's a picture when we go to the second half, if you can put it on the screen because it's in the book, of the default mode network of people who have had good enough parenting, right? And those who have had a dearth of parenting. And the default mode network is all full of connectivity, there's blood flow in those they're in a scanner, they have had some task to do, and then they are told that they can just rest. And when people don't have a task and they have a functioning default mode network, the self-other system, they start thinking about themselves. And they start typically to think about themselves in relationship. So when you look at that picture, what you see is people in a scanner, the below the line is people who, there's no blood flow, there's no connectivity. That whole default mode network is not happening. And so there is no structure in the brain for self and other. And as therapists, we have to wonder if that structure doesn't occur in the brain, who are we in the office with? And who are they in the office with? It's really a mystery. Yeah. But there's no, in one of the interviews that Bessel did of one of my patients, she said, I thought Sebern was on my side. I knew that. I knew she cared about me, but but I didn't really know she was there. Now, I didn't tell her to say that. That's just the reality. People who, and you don't have to be dissociative, although it helps not to but it's all the same problem, that part of the brain is not well organized. So there's no brain structure for me and you. I and thou don't exist in that person's brain.
Yeah. So I think the thing that is that I bump up against in that is I feel like some people do really wonderful work, right? And so I think
Mhm.
about people, I think Ryan's a big fan of Peter Levine,
Oh yeah,
and
me
his,
too, Ryan.
yeah,
Me
and
too. We
his,
were born on the same day, a few blocks away from each other.
that's
Did we
why.
found that out recently? Yeah, yeah.
um, and I mean, in my opinion, a lot of what he's doing is helping people to regulate, feel that, where do you feel it?
Mhm.
Um, but it seems like you're saying that the people who you work with and you worked with are even beyond that.
Well, beyond Peter, I don't know if anyone's beyond Peter because but he's almost a shaman. But Peter has said recently that the future of trauma, and I'm really talking about trauma, right? The future of trauma therapy is somatic experiencing and neurofeedback. And so
And
we,
neurofeedback. Wow.
yeah, oh yeah, no, he knows that the brain has to regulate itself too, or it gets into these loops. Um, but uh, no, I think when you really look at that data, you look at that photo, that fMRI slide, to me the saddest slide in the world. So it's really in the middle of the book in the color section.
Yeah, I found it. I'll put it up in the show notes, so it'll be
Okay.
very obvious. You can
Okay, good.
take a long look at it.
Then it's sort of indisputable. Now those are I don't know 16. I can't remember what the number is, but 16 and patients, and they're the people having the biggest struggle. So that's not going to look like that for everybody who could be seen as having suffered development or did in fact suffer developmental trauma. There will be different extents of that, but to make the point that people on the fMRI, they don't have an I to go to. If they don't have an I, me to go to, they don't have a you to go to. They don't have a theory of mind. They don't have cause and effect. They're operating from very low in the even below the limbic brain. What's recently been discovered, and this is Ruth Lannis's work, is that the part of the brain that fires off first in a trauma response is called the periaqueductal gray, or the PAG. And the PAG is almost at the level of the brainstem. This is a threat detector. This is a reptilian structure that is only about scanning for threat. And that's what sets off the amygdala in a trauma response. So we are not at talk therapy. We're just not doing talk therapy with the reptilian part of our brains. It's not, it just doesn't happen.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit of a technical question, and then I want to give Ryan a chance to ask a question. Because what I found myself doing, and this is before I learned your work, but after I learned about the attachment work, is basically I only see myself as doing emotional regulation in therapy. And by that, what I mean is, I try to be as attuned as I can to the person. And because what I'm doing is usually short-term work, and I realize that there's a lot of limitations to that, my I offer someone an experience, and then I try to guide us through the experience that we have a win, and we as a group feel good about it. So I do groups at at the treatment center, at the inpatient psych center, and we'll do a game called the number game, where you count to 10. And I say this is going to be stressful because you don't know the rules, and we're all going to learn the rules together. And once we learn the rules, then it'll be over. And I'm very, very aware of when so and so goes, like we stop, we process that, and I'm looking not for a cognitive understanding, but for him to feel felt, right? For the affect on his face to change, and for him to feel more comfortable moving forward. Because what I'm assuming is he goes into this place where he feels angry, and he, for whatever reason, cannot handle that. And so once I see Okay, hey man, what's going on? You're getting frustrated? Yeah, this is frustrating, right? Like no one knows the rules, and I'm over here being a jerk to you, not telling you what the rules are. Exactly. Yeah, man, look, I do not mean to frustrate you. This whole purpose is to take one step into this frustration and be able to deal with it as a group. Like, is that something that you feel like you can do? Do we need to take a break? Yada yada yada. I can go on. I mean, you're not really a jerk, you're just doing your job. Okay, and then you go a little bit further. And to me, that's what therapy is now.
Mm-hmm.
It is, of course, using language because that's part of what we have.
Right.
But I'm not looking for you to say these are my coping skills. I'm looking for you to have the experience of being frustrated, being able to rely on a group or on me in some small way, then us moving forward with this task. And I guess my question is, for most of the therapists that you see, have they made that shift, or do you feel like most therapists are still trying to convince people? Because I'm in a very small world, right?
Mm-hmm.
I see the people that I go to work with. 95% of them are clients anyway. I feel
Mm-hmm.
like you have a broader view of the field. Do you feel like people are making that shift? Because that to me feels like the shift that people like Peter Levine and Bessel van der Kolk and yourself are making is how can we look at affect regulation
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in relationship? I think Stephen Porges talks about this as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, he does. He does.
It's like
Not a
talk
therapist,
more
so
about
he doesn't have the in the trenches
right.
view of this, but he does talk about that.
Yeah.
Um, well, I think if anybody works with the population for long that you and I work with, and I assume Ryan's worked with as well, and doesn't get that affect regulation is the key. I remember after having practiced neurofeedback for 5 or 10, maybe even 10 years, I was at a conference with Alan Shore and Bessel and a few other of the celebrity elite therapists. And Bessel in his talk said, if anybody in this audience, 600 people at Harvard, he said, if anybody in this audience knows about how to regulate affect, they have the keys to the kingdom. Okay. So I'm sitting there and I know I have the keys to the kingdom, but I can't stand up. This is a completely naive audience who's come to see the celebrities and say anything to him. So it's years later. It was in 2008, I think, that Bessel and I met. And he sat still long enough to listen, and he was captured. He was captured by the drawings in the book and how the drawings change in 3 months' time, and you just watch if you put that graphic up too, it'll help.
Yeah, I'll have to put that up on the show notes.
Yeah.
But basically, the kid goes from stick figures to full family.
Mm-hmm.
People
And
have fingers
and
and
the
faces.
kid, interestingly, in that, Jordan, the patient, draws himself as the small kid in the first two drawings, and he is the older brother of in the family, and he gains that status in the drawing after 3 months, and I'm assuming in his sense of being as well.
Something else, I don't know if you've looked any at the work coming out of TCU, Texas Christian University.
Tell me.
They have a whole program model called TBRI, Trust-Based Relational Intervention. And
Mm-hmm.
they show some of the same effects that you do, massive increases in IQ, in vocabulary. And they work with kids who have predominantly been adopted or in the
Mm-hmm.
welfare system.
Mm-hmm.
But what they do is they have camps that they run, and each kid has a buddy, and they train every single buddy, who's usually a college student, who's free for the summer, on how to work with these kids. And I thought to myself, man, they do really good work. It is obvious that these kids do really well, and they're able to do this. And I love what they taught me. I thought it was great. but they're able to do this first because these kids are smaller, I think, than these college students are.
Helps.
And they each get a buddy plus a therapist.
Right.
So the amount of resources that they're having to use compared to, one person with EEG, right? It's just completely different, right? If you can take a kid for the summer and just surround him in the most, perfect, ideal environment, that's great. But the amount of resources for that is just immense.
Well, and I would
Even get on the
say
board.
that I would say also that even when adopted kids end up in wonderful families,
Yeah.
that surround them with love.
Yeah.
They and we think, I've been in the attachment field for ever and ever. It is sort of thought that they turned against this family, and there are all kinds of psychological reasons given for it. But if you don't have that system that we're just talking about, the self-other system, the default mode network, default mode just means, what does the brain look like off task? Off task, you should be engaged with yourself and the other. That's not happening. All this is scanning for threat, and they find it. Because, the world is actually, we could always interpret the world as threatening. That's not hard. And if you're primed that way, then even the most loving family fails these kids. And in fact, in Bessel's study, where kids did get better, they just didn't stay better in 20 sessions. So he was looking, all of the parents and the kids want to do more neurofeedback, but they had 20 sessions. They got better, but they were all, his whole sample is adopted kids so you, as much as you can, take the parent variable out of it, for the reason for the kid being so stressed. They just don't, they have poorly organized brains. At every level of the brain.
Yeah. I think the thing that to me was also interesting that the TCU folks was, and they very much acknowledged that, and you could see the foster parents who had this ideal, which was naive and also so hopeful that they're adopting these children into loving homes where they have basically all the things that the kids actually need, right? Like you have food, you have water, you have shelter, you have people who want to care about you. And I absolutely think, that neurofeedback would be really helpful for these kids as well. But the parents also gained new tools in relating to these kids. And I think that was just so powerful. And I think that the way that the world is going, therapists would only be more and more called and pushed to treat these people. And I'm a little bit not annoyed, but frustrated because I don't feel like we're given the tools. And Ryan and I have had long conversations about that, where we're thrown into these situations. And Ryan, you should talk a little bit about where you work, Ryan.
Yeah.
Because I feel like we work in these fields and then we're called to do things that we can't humanly do.
Yeah, that actually kind of leads into the question I was going to ask, because right.
Your audio cut out.
Oh, it cut out?
There you go.
Am I good? Okay. Right now I'm at a outpatient community mental health center. But a lot of what we're talking about right now reminds me, the first job that I had out of grad school was with an adoption agency doing family preservation work, very trauma responses all the time. And I particularly am remembering this first instance where it was the first time that I saw someone have a completely dissociated response. They were tearing up a house. Eyes had rolled back in their head, just everything. And I remember that first realization of, I do not have whatever this family needs. And not only did I not have it as a beginning therapist, no one in this agency had it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there was nothing like what we're talking about right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was, but nobody knew about it.
Well,
right?
yeah,
It was
exactly.
there.
No one knew about it, and no one knew that they didn't know about it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And so I guess one of the thoughts that I have is even something as simple as, now that we are starting to know what we know, lower income families that I work with, neurofeedback is expensive.
Mm-hmm.
What do you imagine are some of the structures that need to be put into place or adjusted or things like that to kind of nudge our field into actually equipping therapists with the things that they need to help people?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, that's the reason that I wrote the book, right? And it is a little bit out in front of what, I mean, when I wrote the book, people weren't talking about developmental trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now everybody's talking about developmental trauma. So hopefully a lot of people will talk about neurofeedback too. It's becoming more and more, it's out there more and more.
Yeah.
And I think that the consumer demand, as it were, that adoptive parents, I mean, that video that I mentioned, if you can put it up for people to watch, is just extraordinary to see the change in this kid. And when parents get an idea that that can happen, or they're in the study with Bessel and they see the changes in their kid that they don't hold because they don't have enough, right? 20 sessions is not enough, right? It's not enough neurofeedback for anybody, just about anybody. It's not magic. It is training the brain toward its own regulation. And these brains are all turned towards survival. And that's it. I mean, if the parents don't serve what they think is their survival needs, this is what you'll see. You know, one of the kids the kid Carl that I talk about, this is a kid who, you know, who didn't like the idea that his adoptive mother was withholding his snack, you know, and went after her with a 2x4. And that's the kid I got. He was 11 years old when he came, and he was uncontrollable. And we did every bit of intensive attachment work that we could do. I took him to, these were the days, I took him to Colorado to work with Foster Klein, who was this genius in attachment work. It didn't matter. I mean, this kid had no way of putting together what was happening. And, you know, he ended up in jail, and he ended up abusing other people. You know, he did his attachment disorder thing. And I think it's getting to the point where people are seeing the limits of medication, the expenses and the degradations of medication, the more and more evidence that neurofeedback works, and that therapy as usual doesn't, that we may be getting to the critical point where, you know, adoption agencies won't open without a training room. You know, it just won't make sense. I have a colleague who has a slightly different approach to neurofeedback, and she wants to do brain brightening with elders, right? Mm-hmm. So I said, okay, have an open house and invite every system, you know, the people who run the systems at every senior center, at every retirement facility, you know, at every assisted living, and make sure they all see that all the others are invited. So you say, oh, if they're going to get, their people are going to get, that's going to be a competitive advantage. But right now, it's only expensive. You know, you have to be altruistic, or you have to have had an experience like I had, where my brain just felt this in such a profound way that I couldn't turn away from it. I just had it wasn't even ethical. It wasn't in my being to turn away from knowing that this could happen. Not if it could happen for me. It was my startle response that I had lived with for I started this when I was 50, that I'd had that entire time and went away. It was extraordinary. So, how can you have that experience and not mortgage your house, which is what I did, to buy one of the early systems? I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do anything else.
I think one of the things you said, I think in a previous podcast, was schools, right? Have it a part of the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
Which to me is like, the low-hanging fruit, right? As if you can actually get it, especially because, and I don't know how I feel about this, but it feels like there's a societal push for schools to do more. And I know teachers and principals need something
Right.
that works with kids. And most of what they do, they feel like is ineffective. So I know teachers would be all about it. And it's also a way to standardize care. I mean, I think I know one or two therapists who are just worth their weight in gold. And I think that, I know one or two of those out of the people that I've met.
Right, I know.
And if you go to a school, they're probably not going to get that person, because that person's going to want to charge more than that. So a standard level of care that you can say, yeah, we're going to do, every, kid in the 6th grade or whatever, and just run them through. Might be helpful. I don't know. First grade.
Grade.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this isn't, the problem is, of course, these kids go back to bad neighborhoods or bad families or whatever, but it's still, it's the most cost-effective intervention, and it could be available to every kid, because the disturbed kids who grab a lot of resources and aren't helped by any of the resources that they consume, by and large, that's one group that gets training. But if all students get training, their reading scores go up, and their athletics get better, and they get to be better chess players, and they can they can do math more easily. All of those things that are available to them as natural gifts, but that are unavailable to them because of the environmental circumstances, that you can really help a kid, and then the parents see it, and the parents, I mean, I think you're right. School, and I did say that, so at the end of the book, that that schools are the natural place for this to happen. It does take training, and the EAGER system, which is a system that I use, is really a clinical system, and there have to be systems that are more that you would use in a therapy office. But there are other systems where kids can learn the basics of this, and what you see when their arousal goes down is you see more empathy. And so the whole movement in schools toward teaching kids social relational skills is deeply enhanced by affect regulation. Obviously, those two things go together. When you look at Shore's title, Affect Regulation and the Origin of Self, okay, there it is. There it is. That's exactly what we're talking about. That we can help kids and adults, even seniors, develop more of a sense of self and other in relationship. It doesn't matter the age. But it matters the age in terms of a child having a chance for a decent life and not going off into an institution or residential care, or beating up his wife, or crashing a car. It's just all of those things. Steph Curry, from what I understand, does neurofeedback. So if that doesn't inspire people to do neurofeedback, I don't know what would. I mean, I don't know. You have to be a basketball fan, I guess, but
yeah.
So, and more Olympic athletes are doing neurofeedback.
Yeah, because they know that that's where the leading edge is.
Yeah, the leading edge, exactly.
Which dovetails, and I have two more questions, and I want to let Ryan ask as many as he can, but where do you feel like the leading edge is for our field? You're obviously on one of the edges with neurofeedback, but if you were to say, man, I wish we could peel back the layer on this or know more about this part.
Well, yeah, there's sort of two parts. I mean, we can do a lot of perfecting of neurofeedback for sure. I mean, we don't know how to help everybody. But I am, as very much a layperson, as somebody who never got, I mean, did you have training in the brain in your program?
I did. It was minimal, but the guy who did it was a big fan of Peter Levine and had been through a lot of extra training and said, we got to talk about this. And he did the whole hand model of the brain and, all that sort of stuff.
Dan Siegel. Yeah. Well, there's more to it than that. And I guess for me, the cutting edge is what is the interface. How does looking? I'm doing a workshop in a couple of weeks in Atlanta, and the title of this workshop is "Does Neuroscience Change Everything?" And it really does. When you have to start, when you really begin an encounter with the brain, it's a different encounter than with the mind, and we have different sets of understandings. So when you look there's Ruth Lanius has just recently mapped out this hyperlinkage between the periaqueductal gray and the amygdala. So this reptilian part of the threat detector, scanning the environment, it sets off the amygdala, and then all hell breaks loose in the person and then in society. She's just found that. Right? That's just in the last year that we even know about this. And so and when I asked her, so how do you think people manage the fact that this linkage is linked like this all the time? And she said, dissociation. And then I thought, well, okay, but we've all learned that dissociation is a defense. It's something that the mind does to ward off terrible feelings. That doesn't appear to be the case. So we look at these slides and we say, oh, hyperlinkage here. This is a brain that's wired differently. If it's wired differently, is it even salient anymore to call this a defense? It's a state of being of people who have been tormented like they have, who have lived in this absence of a mother. Really. I was watching Jesus Christ Superstar. The NBC had an incredible version of this. If you like that opera, this is an absolutely incredible version of it with John Legend as Christ.
Oh, wow.
And Dixon.
I'm sold.
Huh?
I said I'm sold.
Okay, and Brandon Dixon was Judas. It's just extraordinary. Yeah. But on the cross, and this is in the scripture, right? Jesus is saying, "Who is my mother? Where is my mother?" And I was just struck by it because here we're talking about clinical and brain phenomenon that reveal motherlessness in the brain structure, right? And then we tried to do something for that as psychotherapists and about that, at the same time dreading the transferences that developed as a result of motherlessness, the borderline transference, it's like, yikes, so in terms of, I'm sold on figuring out a new language or a new way of thinking about, or a more complete way of thinking about this brain-mind interface. And I have taken, was invited to go to Plum Village, which is a retreat center for Thich Nhat Hanh, a Zen master who's written a gazillion books on meditation and on peace, and peace is the way. There's no way to peace. Peace is the way. That kind of thing. And he's brilliant and wonderful. And he had a stroke, and they asked if I would come and help him with neurofeedback. So yeah, so
that's absurd. No. That's absurd. That is absurd.
Yeah, they were on. They got it. See, these monks understood that the brain couldn't work the way that neuroscience suggests it does in the present term, and Ty loved doing neurofeedback. And he endorsed it as a new Dharma door. So okay. So that's amazing. And so the monks at Plum Village, I'm just telling you the real story. The monks at Plum Village invited a bunch of us, and Ruth Lannis is one of them, to come to Plum Village for a neuroscience retreat. And we did a 7-day retreat on neuroscience, trauma, and the sense of mind and brain. Okay, you asked me where the leading edge was, Jordan.
I'm pretty sure that it makes you the next Buddha. Like, I'm pretty sure that makes you the next Buddha. Oh my God, so glad to meet you. Leading the way for Ty. That's what you call him now. Like, he's gone.
Yeah, Ty. Yeah, Ty is
in meeting. So, I mean, this leads right into meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you had a very profound experience yourself. I've started meditating about 2 years now. Did you start meditating before or after you started doing neurofeedback?
Oh, before.
Before.
Yeah.
And it never got you to the same state as the neurofeedback did.
No, and it wouldn't now either. They're different. It's different. But no, it never regulated affect at the level that I wanted or needed. I mean, I didn't know. Of course, as you said earlier, you don't know what you don't know. And I had no idea that I could feel what I was. I had no idea that I was feeling what I was feeling. Right. I lived in it. It's like does the fish know it's in water? It's like when you just live in that all the time, you have no idea that that there's another way to be. And the kids you're talking about, and the people who are feeling suicidal, they don't have an idea that there's another way to be.
Can you talk about how they're different? You said meditation and the feedback are different.
Well, meditation is really working, it's working at the level of mind and quieting the mind chatter, right? It's just bringing that all, doing that to get quiet. And it's very difficult to do that in a system that's in a tumble, that is torn apart inside itself. It's not, suicides happen at retreat centers. It's like people expect that they can get to this place with meditation. They stop taking their meds. I go to a meditation center called IMS near me in Barre, Massachusetts. And in the instructions to retreatants, it says going off your psychotropic medications while on retreat can be reason for dismissal from the retreat. So you can see that a number of people are hoping that meditation will in fact do what they hope it will regulate affect, but it doesn't. And so that retreat centers end up working with a lot of emotional crises that they're not prepared to work